Welcome to this course on the history of Christianity in Egypt. Many students have told me over the years that they're bored with history. To a large extent, I think this has been due to the fact of how they've been taught history in the past. History can be boring if it's just presented as a series of facts and dates, and I hope that we can do better than that in this class. For me, history is going to be your history here in Egypt. The history of the church in Egypt is highly relevant to the modern situation. So I hope that you'll come to this class with an open mind and be prepared to study the last 2,000 years of history in Egypt, to learn how the church has grown and developed over time. And I hope that you will see how your history has not only developed, but also how it continues to be relevant today, to your situation today. Many people in the West find it difficult to believe at times that there's any Christianity at all left in the Middle East. A few years ago, an American historian who's very popular, Philip Jenkins, wrote a book entitled The Lost History of Christianity. And it should have been The Lost History of Christianity in the Middle East, because that was really the focus of the book. And it was a book that was not written for people in the Middle East. It was written for Westerners. And it has a subtitle that clarifies exactly what he was trying to say. The subtitle is The 1,000-Year Golden Age of the Church in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and How It Died. So he's presenting the history of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa as something that no longer exists, as something that has died. And of course we know that it hasn't died, that in fact it continues to live and is vibrant in many ways. Kenneth Bailey was a New Testament scholar who was the son of a United States Presbyterian missionary couple. And he grew up in Egypt in the 20th century, in the decades before the Second World War. A few years back, he wrote a book entitled The Prodigal Son. And he argues in this book that Westerners need to understand the history of the Middle East in order to understand the Bible, in order to understand biblical stories. That it's really impossible for us to properly interpret the Scripture unless we understand its Middle East context. That's true for Westerners, but he also might have been writing for Middle Easterners, that the history of the Middle East and understanding that history and culture is important for understanding Scripture. I'm speaking to you today from the Center for the Study of Middle East Christianity, or CMEC, here at ETSC, which is on the 3rd floor of the administration building. And this was an institution that developed just a few years ago that was inspired by Bailey's dream to have a place where the history and the culture of the Middle East could be studied so that we could better understand the Scriptures in the future. Chapter 1 that you'll be reading this week begins with the pre-Christian period of Egyptian history. And you may wonder, why is it necessary for us to study the pre-history of Christianity in the Middle East? This is, after all, a course on the history of Christianity in the Middle East. And the short answer is that that human beings are only able to accept something or understand something new in terms of what's preceded, in terms of what they already understand. And therefore, understanding the prehistory of Christianity in Egypt is important for understanding how the people of Egypt would have accepted and understood Christianity. For example, it would be very difficult to preach the good news to people who had no concept of God, or who had no concept of a spirit world, or no concept of an afterlife. It would be very hard for such people to introduce the gospel to them in any effective way that they would have understood. On the other hand, if people have a highly developed and highly internalized set of religious beliefs, it may be hard to convince them of an alternative view. Christian missionaries have discovered that this is exactly the case, as they've encountered peoples who have embraced the great world religions such as Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. What we find in ancient Egyptian history is that Egyptians had some highly developed religious concepts, such as the belief in the existence of a high God, the belief in an afterlife and in an underworld, and they were familiar with such ideas as resurrection and the final judgment. And as it turns out, these ideas and their accompanying religious practices didn't block or impede Egyptians from accepting the gospel. Rather, they seemed to work as a way of preparation for their reception of the gospel. So when the gospel message came to Egypt, Egyptians were remarkably responsive to it. Another thing that helped to make Egyptians ready to receive the gospel was the existence in Egypt, and especially in the city of Alexandria, of a large number of Jewish people. When they arrived, how many they were, are the subjects of ongoing historical debate. But the fact that they were in Egypt and an important and an influential part of the society at that time is entirely accepted. One of the issues that historians debate is when Christianity came to Egypt. The tradition of the Coptic Orthodox Church is that St. Mark, the writer of the second gospel, brought it to Egypt, probably to the city of Alexandria, in the middle of the 1st century, that is, within a couple of decades of the death of Christ. But there is no direct contemporary evidence for this. There is, however, some later evidence for this, especially the history of the early Christians that was written by Eusebius in the early 4th century. There's also a letter that was written by Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century that asserts that St. Mark was in fact the founder of Egyptian Christianity. Remarkably, this letter only came to light in the year 1958. Much of the history that we have from the early church is based on legend or myth, and it's not always very reliable, especially when it comes to the so-called apostolic foundings of certain churches. But all the evidence suggests that St. Mark actually was the founder of the church in Egypt. One of the things that makes scholars question the existence of an Egyptian church as early as the 1st century is the lack of Christian literature from this period. After all, Egypt's dry climate makes it an excellent place for the preservation of papyrus paper, and lots of it has been found in Egypt from the 1st and 2nd centuries. Why then is there no mention of Christianity in these documents if Christianity in fact began as early as the middle of the 1st century? Historians have come up with 2 plausible arguments to explain this, which I've reviewed in the text. And lastly, there is at least some biblical evidence for the existence of Christianity in the 1st century itself, although it's not very strong. And this too I will review for you in the text. Again, I want to welcome you to this class on the history of Christianity in Egypt. I hope that you will enjoy it, and I hope that you will benefit from it.